very much appreciate this opportunity to give evidence. I'm grateful to the whole committee. You of course come to the heart of the matter, in particular in your connection to the passage of the EU Withdrawal Act, for which I was responsible in the Commons, and my resignation not far after. So obviously David Davis and I were very close to one another, and it became apparent to me in the preceding week that the government was going to adopt a policy for EU exit that I would not be able to support. Indeed, I declined a number of meetings in the preceding days because I felt I could not bear to go through the business of being persuaded to capitulate and support the proposals. I came to believe over the course of my time in government that one of the reasons I'd been made a minister was so when the moment came of capitulation I would be asked to sell it, and of course I was not willing to do so. So as we approached the Chequers debacle, I felt aware of what was going to happen, that we would have an EEA-light style Brexit with a customs union light alongside it, which I was not willing to support. So it was not it wasn't a particular surprise to me when Chequers happened. I stayed close to David Davis, and when David decided to resign, I knew I was going to go with him. In a sense, I tried to minimise the impact in the media by going absolutely at the same time, which meant, of course, I was a single line on the Today programme rather than the story. But it was not the first time I'd considered resigning. I previously considered resigning over the failure of the government to make public no-deal preparation. I very nearly resigned in March. I decided not to because of the passage of the EU Withdrawal Act. I felt that I could not responsibly resign before that Act had completed its passage.
Thank you very much. And again, has the Brexit process and the Brexit negotiations, in your view, had an impact on public confidence in democratic and parliamentary government? And if so, in what ways? And could or should the government have done more to inform and explain to the public what it was all about?
Well, Sir William, that is a huge question. I'd like, if I may, to answer it in two parts. A little about the strategic communication and a little about confidence in government. I vividly recall a conversation shortly after Suella Braverman joined the department. I've asked to go back and look at the papers. But all the ministers came together in our conference room and were briefed on the kind of exit we could have. Either what I would characterise as a high alignment Brexit, something like the EEA plus something like the customs union, or a normal advanced free trade agreement. And after going to and fro through the briefing, all of the ministers in the department together decided that we wanted a normal advanced free trade agreement because that would be the kind of Brexit which would fulfil the mandate of the referendum and indeed the mandate of the preceding speeches, the mandate of the general election. Our officials looked somewhat crestfallen. Clearly the advice was to go for a high alignment Brexit. And then subsequently, in a sense, the rest is history, because the European Union then offered us that kind of Brexit. President Tusk's offer on behalf of the Council included an advanced free trade agreement.
Can you give a sense as to what that date was, more or less?
It will have, I think it was in February. I've been back to my notes this morning. I can't find the exact date this morning, but as I say, I have asked to go back to the department and examine the papers, and I'll be happy to write to the committee and let you know, Sir William, exactly when that happened. But what clearly happened subsequently, as David Davis explained in his evidence to the committee, is that we ended up with a parallel process of policy development. Within the department, ministers led by David Davis were developing one policy, and the Cabinet Office Europe unit clearly developing another, which was revealed at Chequers. David, I think he's attested that he had 5 days' notice. And it seems to me that this is a considerable abuse of our Constitution. For a Secretary of State to be cut out of the development of his main policy is quite a debacle. And it seems that something similar happened to Dominic Raab as his successor.
Can you sort of explain in words which demonstrate the sequence of events how you saw this divergence of opinion and thoughts as between number 10, who was responsible, and also what was going on in the department? Because you're demonstrating at the moment that you were picking up messages. You thought you might resign at an earlier stage, but you thought you'd better stay there because of the withdrawal bill. But there comes a time when you're conscious of the fact that you're operating in what appears to be different silos. And that must have been quite an experience, because after all, as you quite rightly say, the Secretary of State is the person given the responsibility for carrying out the functions of Secretary of State and having to appear in the House of Commons, to appear accountable. You're there with him and having to do a similar kind of job.
Yes.
So can you just sort of explain the relationship with number 10? And was it like a bunker, for example?
Not really words as
I think, Sir William, it's worth just restating the context. So my job was primarily domestic preparedness and legislation, with some English regional engagement, for example. And I was originally responsible as the junior minister for all legislation, and I handed over the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill to Suella Braverman after she joined. So my responsibility...
Can you speak a little bit more slowly, because you're saying some very important things.
So my responsibility was mostly to get that act through, the EU Withdrawal Act, and to make sure that all departments were preparing properly for all exit scenarios. And that, of course, was all-consuming. My duties were therefore mostly UK-facing, not facing the negotiation. But, of course, on important papers, we would see, I wouldn't see all the papers, but I would see a good number of the papers, in particular the summer policy papers which we produced. So they seemed, as I think the EU Commissioner said, like applications to join. Now, the reason I mention this is that the constant refrain throughout the time, my time in government, was this atmosphere of reluctance to leave. And I think this is at the heart of the problem. While we won the vote, we did not win the argument for want of a better term, I would call the governing class. So we've ended up with those who govern being forced to do that which they must, take us out. But it's not that which they choose. And that suffuses the entire approach. The entire approach is suffused by a reluctance to deliver what the public wanted, which is us controlling our wars in our parliament, with all that that means. So the relationship between number 10 and the Dexter ministers was always one of instinctive tension, because I think it's fair to say, as Mr Jones will know, that the Dexter ministers overwhelmingly are people who believe in exiting the European Union.
He was a minister before you were.
Indeed, yeah. And, we're ministers who believed in exiting the EU, whereas overwhelmingly the staff of number 10 seemed, for the most part, not to be people with a heart for it. And I think that tension suffused the entire process, and we were regularly overruled. So, for example, after President Tusk made his offer of security cooperation, participation in institutions of research, innovation, education and culture, dealing with absurdities, he mentioned flights, I would add a range of other things, driving licences, data, and so on. He also offered an advanced free trade agreement, all sectors, no tariffs, you know what he offered. Once he'd made that offer, I was very pleased, because it matched the policy which Dexter ministers had decided, and I wanted to start putting it in my speeches. And one speech in particular, I remember, was edited by number 10 to remove references to that offer, because of course it was not the offer which the system as a whole wanted. So what I would say is that we were silos is a good way to look at it, but it's silos not only in terms of policy, but also in terms of mentality. I take an expansive view of the world. I want us to be a country which is outward, facing a global citizen, free trading with the world. But I think that many of those determining policy are so wedded to the European Union and this idea of integration for the purpose of free trade that they cannot face up to enthusiastically delivering the mandate that they have. And that has meant our entire negotiation has been fearful, conducted in a posture of supplication. It's difficult to be too damning about the attitude that's been brought to the negotiation. But that's not to condemn the individuals who I feel sure are all doing their best within their view of their duty to the nation. But unfortunately, they don't believe in what they're doing.